This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and today we're continuing with Limited Set Review Week here on my channel. We're looking at Core Set 2020. We're looking at all the cards in each of the colors over the next several days. We looked at white yesterday. Today we're continuing with blue. Before we get started, I want to let you know that the way I grade these is with letter grades. In the description below, you can find out what each of those letter grades means. Alright, now let's dive right in and look at our first blue card, which is Ether Gust. So this is one generic and a blue for an uncommon instant, and it says, choose target spell or permanent that's red or green. Its owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. So, as we saw yesterday, there's a cycle of color hosing cards like this at uncommon in the set, and they're all pretty great, provided your opponent is playing one or both of the colors that it hates on. Both is ideal, but I think these are all powerful enough that you side them in even against an opponent who is only one of the colors. 2 mana for this effect is a great deal. Countering a spell, essentially, and putting it back in their library, or time-ebbing something is pretty nice. Note, though, that your opponent does decide whether it goes on top or bottom when you cast this. You don't get to decide. So where should you pick cards like this, these hate cards that are in this cycle? Well, provided you aren't playing best of one on Arena pretty early. Over the course of a draft, you are pretty much guaranteed to play against someone who it is good against, and usually you'll run into a couple of people that fit the bill there. I don't think you want to run these main board, even though it's probably like 40% chance that your opponent will be affected by this, just because it will be a completely blank card a good chunk of the time. But these are incredible out of your sideboard and become one of the best cards in your deck. This means that you should take this type of card and the others in the cycle over decent but unimpressive playables. So I think this is an F as a main board card, but a B out of your sideboard. Next up, we have Agent of Treachery, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 2/3 human rogue at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you gain control of target permanent, and he also says at the beginning of your end step, if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own, draw 3 cards. So this might cost 7 mana, but there's a reason it does. Stealing an opponent's permanent is one of the most powerful things you can do in the entire game. It is essentially always going to give you a 2-for-1 because it effectively is a removal spell, since it takes away your opponent's best permanent and then gives it to you. We see effects like this cost 6 or 7 usually, and many of them are less permanent than this one because they involve an aura. Those cards are already pretty good, but Agent of Treachery makes sure you keep the creature most of the time. Do note that they can still bounce the creature back to their hand to get it back. On top of all of that, blue and white have ways to flicker or blink creatures, letting you use this into the battlefield ability, potentially more than once, at which point your opponent is just done. The part about drawing cards if you have 3 or more of your opponent's permanents is basically win more, and it's probably never going to happen in this format, and again, if it did, if you have 3 of their permanents, they're probably dead anyway. So how do we rate this? In a vacuum, it is one of the most powerful cards in the whole set, but it does cost 7 mana, and that's not something every deck will be interested in doing. Even with that high mana cost, though, this is so powerful that I still think it's a bomb. It just completely reshapes the board and is always going to have a massive impact. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, we have Air Elemental, which costs 3 generic and 2 blue for a 4/4 elemental at uncommon, and it has flying. Air Elemental has been around forever and appeared in tons of sets. It certainly isn't exciting or flashy, but is a card that does very well in the vanilla test. A 5 mana 4/4 flyer is more than you expect to get. The elemental creature type carries significant weight in this set too, so that's a little bit of an extra bonus. I think this is a B-, which is the grade I've given to it pretty much every time we've seen it. It is first pickable sometimes, even if it doesn't do anything all that interesting. Next up we have Anticipate, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This isn't all that impressive and limited, especially in a set without a real Spells Matter deck. It gives you card selection, not card advantage, making it a super replaceable card, and just spinning your wheels like that in limited usually isn't a great plan. I think it's very easy to cut this, but as a 23rd playable, you could do worse. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, we have a Temsis, All-Seeing, who for 3 generic and 3 blue is a 4/5 legendary Sphinx at rare, has flying. You can pay 2 generic and a blue and tap it to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. And whenever a Temsis All-Seeing deals damage to an opponent, you may reveal your hand. If cards with at least 6 different converted mana costs are revealed this way, that player loses the game. So there's a cycle of these triple-colored legendaries in this set. This is the blue part of that cycle. A 6-mana 4/5 flyer isn't the greatest stats around, but it is passable, probably a C or so. However, I really like Tempest's activated ability, drawing 2 cards and discarding 1. I see 2 courses of action when you play this Sphinx. One of them is that it dominates the sky and you can just kill them with your big flyer. If you can't attack though and have to hold a Tempest back, well, then you can just use that powerful activated ability every turn, and there's a good chance you find a way to win the game that way too, since it gives you serious card advantage and selection. The alternate win condition thing is cute, but I don't see it being particularly easy to pull off in Limited, so I wouldn't put much stock in it. Overall, I think Tempest is pretty good. Maybe a bit clunky, especially with triple blue, but I think I'm interested in first picking this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up is Befuddle, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -4, -0 until end of turn, draw a card. Whenever we've seen this card before, it has been in a format with a Spells Matter deck, something this format doesn't really have a ton of support for. This makes it really unimpressive to me. Blue combat tricks are always pretty underwhelming because you really only get to take down a creature with it if you were already trading. Sure, when you are able to do that, you get a 2-for-1 with Befuddle, but those situations won't come up enough. Most of the time, you'll prevent some damage and draw a card for 3 mana, which is fine, but very replaceable. I think this is just a D+ in this format, an easy card to cut from your deck. Next up, we have Bone to Ash, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a common instant, and it says counter target creature spell, draw a card. I am not normally the biggest proponent of counter magic in Limited, especially when it costs 4 mana, but Bone to Ash is usually good enough to be something you play one of in most blue decks. What makes it worthwhile? Well, the fact that you get a 2-for-1 anytime you get to use it, which is pretty devastating for your opponent. Now, it comes with the huge downside most counter spells have. Your opponent can easily play around it, especially if they have some non-creatures to play while you have your mana up. When they do that, you're going to take a huge tempo hit. But still, creatures are the most common spell type in Limited by a wide margin, so most of the time they'll have to play something into this, though I would say that the ideal thing to do with this is not leave mana up for it until you have nothing else you can do on your turn. That way, you avoid the tempo hit. This is a solid counterspell, and that means it's decent and worth playing one of. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Boreal Elemental, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/4 elemental at common. It's got flying, and it says spells your opponent cast that target Boreal Elemental cost 2 more to cast. I like this alright. A 5-mana 3/4 flyer is already kind of solid, maybe a C. This one is harder to kill than most thanks to its ability, and I think that is enough to make this a decent top curve flyer to have in your deck. Does that extra ability push this above a solid C? I don't think it really does, though we could maybe say it's a 77 instead of a 75, but I still think that makes it a C. Next up, we have Brine-born Cutthroat, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Pirate at uncommon. It's got flash, and whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Brine-born Cutthroat. A 2-mana 2/1 with flash is already a pretty decent card, since you can flash it in and ambush small creatures, sometimes just get a nice trade. It would probably be enough for a C. This comes with some additional upside, basically paying you off for having instants or creatures with flash, and that way I guess Brine-born Cutthroat gets kind of better in multiples. This will come up some for sure, since most decks, especially blue ones in Limited, will run a few instants. However, I'm not sure you'll really be able to build around it enough for it to be anything incredible. I think it just tops out around a C. Next up, we have Captivating Geyer, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, return up to 3 target creatures to their owner's hands. This is a clunky effect. It costs a lot of mana. Maybe not every deck wants it, but it's a great thing to have at the top of your curve in most blue decks, I would think. You are going to get a nice bit of tempo here because you're going to pay 6 mana and then you're going to bounce 3 things that most likely cost your opponent more than 6 mana to cast. It has some additional flexibility because you can actually bounce your own creatures with it. Maybe they have a pacifism on them. Maybe they have an Enter the Battlefield trigger you want to get all over again. But the fact is, sometimes you'll bounce your own stuff with it too. And it's the kind of effect that completely reshapes the board, at least temporarily, because all of a sudden your opponent just lost 3 things that may have been holding back the block, and this is just going to end the game in some cases. Again, it has a high mana cost, it's difficult, but I can't see myself not wanting one of these in most of my blue decks. It's not a super replaceable kind of effect. To be able to hit 3 different permanents, creatures specifically with it, is just great. I don't think you really want more than one because they're expensive. You also can't really splash them. But I think running one in most blue decks is ideal, and I think they're strong enough and irreplaceable enough that I think I would like to get one of these relatively early, though I don't think it quite reaches first pick range. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Cavalier of Gales, which for 2 generic and 3 blue is a 5/5 elemental knight at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you get to brainstorm. In other words, draw 3 cards and put 2 from your hand on top of your library in any order. And then when it dies, it's shuffled into its owner's library and you scry 2. This whole cycle's great, but I think this one and the red one, which we'll look at later this week, are the ones in contention for best in the bunch. It has the best stats as a 5-mana 5/5 flyer, and it has a brainstorm attached to it. That's considerably better than a 5-mana 5/5 flyer that draws you a card, which would already be like a B+. I also like that it goes back into your library and lets you scry when it dies. Basically, this knight lets you see a ton of cards, even in a worst case scenario, and frequently your opponent just won't be able to kill it, and it will just kill them in the sky anyway. The triple blue cost is a little bit of a pain, but this is a straight bomb, and I'm giving it an A. Next up, we have Cerulean Drake, which costs 1 generic and a blue for a 1/1 flying Drake at uncommon. It's got protection from red. Again, that's a mechanic that is returning, that's been gone for a while. Basically, this creature can't be blocked, targeted, dealt damage, enchanted, or equipped by anything red. And it has an activated ability where you can sack it to counter a spell that targets you. This is not the kind of protection card that I think you really ever want to be mainboarding in this format. It doesn't have good stats for its cost, for one thing, and its activated ability is really narrow. As a result, I think this is an F as a mainboard card. Now, when you play against someone who's playing red, obviously it moves up in value. They're more likely to have spells that target you, and obviously they're more likely to have red cards. And in those cases, it gets to be pretty good, though it's still not like it's incredible. You know, it doesn't present them with a quick clock. Mostly all Cerulean Drake's going to do is block indefinitely some big red creature and not be able to be killed by your opponent's efficient red removal, which is fine. But what I'm saying is it's not one of these sideboard cards that is hugely impactful when you do side it in, like some of the other color-hating cards in the set. I think it's a C+ out of your sideboard, an F in your main board. Next up, we have Cloudkin Seer, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/1 elemental wizard at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. This is an excellent common, perhaps blue's best common. 3 mana for a 2/1 flyer is probably a D+, and adding card draw is a massive upgrade. This means that this can frequently be a 2-for-1. Even if you play it late and can't really attack, you're still getting some use out of this card thanks to the extra card you draw too. I think you jam as many of these into any blue deck you can build, and I think you can first pick it in some situations. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Convolute, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says counter target spell unless its controller pays 4. This is another reprint, and we've seen it before, and it's been underwhelming every time. You know, Bone to Ash presents you with a 2-for-1 all the time, and it's a hard counter, at least for creatures. Convolute, not ever going to give you a 2-for-1, and in the later game, it starts to become less and less useful because your opponent has more mana lying around and can pay for Convolute. All of that makes it really unimpressive to me. I think I'm just going to steer clear from playing it as much as I can. There will be times when you really want it. Maybe it's a little better out of your sideboard, but I think most of the time you don't want to play it. Giving it a D+. Next up, we have Drawn from Dreams, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare sorcery. It says, look at the top 7 cards of your library, put 2 of them in your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I think this play on words here is pretty fun, and I think the card's pretty nice too. 4 mana to get some serious card selection, while you're also always going to get a 2-for-1 out of it, seems pretty nice. It is a sorcery, and sometimes you just won't have time to do something like this because you have to find a way to survive after your opponent's aggressive start, and you just need to play creatures who can trade. But if you do manage to stabilize, this will go a long way towards helping you out. 7 cards is a ton to look at in a limited deck, so you have a good chance at hitting whatever card you need to save the day. I'm going to start this as a B- with the caveat that if this format turns out to be super fast, maybe this slips. Next up, we have Dungeon Geist, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 spirit at rare. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Dungeon Geists. This is a reprint, and it was a bomb last time we saw it, and that's what it'll be here. 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer is already good enough for close to a B-, so when you tack on the ability to tap down your opponent's best creature as long as the Geists stay alive, you're doing a pretty good job. This usually ensures that the Geist can go after your opponent and will often just result in you having more favorable attacks even the turn you play the Geist. The one thing is that the Geist isn't exactly huge and it does die to lots of removal, but even when that happens immediately, you're still getting a tiny bit of value out of tapping the creature down during your turn, and that's an okay consolation prize. I think this is first pickable almost every time you see it, unless your pack has a foil rare or mythic in it or something. This is an A. Next up, we've got Faerie Miscreant, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 Fairy Rogue at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control another creature named Faerie Miscreant, you get to draw a card. So here's the blue card in the common collect 'em all cycle in this set. We have seen this exact card before back in Magic Origins, and it was pretty solid there, though it is worth noting that was an ultra-aggressive format. 1 mana 1/1 flyers are some of the most overrated creatures around, especially by newer players. They're something like a D or a D- because of how quickly they get outclassed, so that is the base grade we're looking at here. However, if you can draw a card off of them, you're talking about a much better card. I don't think the grade improves much with just 2 of them, but by the time you get to 3, it is probably at least a C or a C-, and with 4, it is firmly in the C range. It is kind of annoying that you have to have the other miscreants in play specifically to get the effect here, but I think you should play these if you get enough. Also worth noting that there are some payoffs for playing a bunch of flyers, and Faerie Miscreant fits well into that deck. But yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhere in the C range once you get to 3, and definitely in the C range when you get to 4. So yeah, I mean, basically my strategy with this particular collect 'em all card is to pick up any that I start to see later in packs, and then they progressively move up in pick order the more you have. And I do think Faerie Miscreant, because it's an evasive creature, probably is better in even more multiples than some of the others, like 5 or 6 of them. Probably not a bad idea, just because it does always have evasion, and if it's always drawing you a card, it's going to be amazing. So yeah, Faerie Miscreant, it's, you know, it has a range of how good it is depending on how many you have, just like the other cards in the cycle. Next up, we have Flood of Tears, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a rare sorcery. It says return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control this way, you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. This is really good. The downside with this type of symmetrical bounce effect is that your opponent always gets to rebuild their board before you do. This gets around that by letting you put a permanent back on the battlefield right away. Now, you do have to set up the board just right to get full value out of it, but I think that your board will have 4 permanents often enough for this to be really powerful. It gets even better in conjunction with enter the battlefield triggers and the like. So yeah, you get to hit a reset button and start to rebuild your board first, and anytime you can do that, stuff seems pretty great. Now, I do think this falls short of being a bomb because sometimes it just won't do what you need, but I do think I want to be first picking this most of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Fortress Crab, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 1/6 crab at common. So here's the mediocre defensive crab that appears at a common in basically every set. 4 mana for a 1/6 is certainly impressive if that's what you're looking for, and it is nice that it completely shuts down X1s your opponent has. I still don't think you usually want to be playing this, except in some rare cases, but I do think it is decent sideboard material against creatures who have 1 toughness or less. I think this is just a D, though. Next up, we have Frilled Sea Serpent, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 4/6 serpent at common. It has an activated ability where you pay 5 generic and 2 blue, and it can't be blocked this turn. It hasn't been very long since we last saw this reprint. A 6 mana 4/6 isn't anything special, and paying 7 to make it unblockable is a lot, especially bad against someone who has instant speed removal or bounce ready to go the moment you use this ability. But if you were desperate for a top curve evasive win condition, well, the Sea Serpent can do that job, if kind of inefficiently. I think in an ideal world, you probably avoid running this and hope for a better win condition, but I think it's a D+. Next up, we have Frostlings, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 elemental cat at common. When it enters the battlefield, you tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Anytime Frostling shows up, it ends up being one of blue's best commons. It is just an amazing card for tempo, doing a decent mana war impression. Adding to the board while also making your opponent's best creature more or less disappear from it for a couple of turns is excellent. The Lynx is at its best in aggressive decks. That's because this type of effect means your opponent can't block with that creature for 2 turns, but it only means they can't attack for a single turn. But still, it is great either way, and this format also has ways to abuse into the battlefield abilities, like that of the Lynx, and it has the elemental creature type, which also matters. This is borderline first pickable in weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Hard Cover, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon aura. It's an enchant creature, and the enchanted creature gets +0/+2 and has tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Well, if you know me, I don't normally like auras. This is because they can easily result in you getting 2 for 1. There are some auras I like, though. There are those that replace themselves one way or another, and then there are those that were really cheap, so getting 2 for 1 is at least not as big of a tempo hit. Thick cover is in the latter group. For 1 blue mana, making a creature have higher toughness and the ability to loot is actually something I'll be interested in some of my blue decks. I like looting, as it helps you win games through card selection, sifting through lands you don't need, and helping you find more spells, or helping you hit land drops if that's what you need. Now, this card isn't great by any stretch. It's decent and playable, but those are both things I don't say about a ton of auras. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Ley Line of Anticipation, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment. It has the Ley Line clause. If it's in your opening hand, you get to put it on the battlefield right away. And it says you may cast spells as though they had flash. So, we're 2 for 2 now on Ley Lines that get Fs. 4 mana for this effect just isn't worth it. It doesn't allow you to add to the board at all. Sure, if you can get this in your opening hand, it would feel pretty good, but that happening is nowhere close to a guarantee. I think you should just avoid playing it altogether, and it's an F. Next up, we have Masterful Replication, which for 5 generic and a blue is a rare instant. It says choose one, create 2 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature tokens, or choose target artifact you control. Each other artifact you control becomes a copy of that artifact until end of turn. This is pretty powerful. Most of the time you'll be choosing the golem option. The other option will come up some. There are several artifacts in this set, but most of the time I see the 2 golem option being the good one, but that's okay because 6 mana to make 2 3/3 golems at instant speed is an excellent deal. It isn't a stretch to think that this will give you a 2 for 1 some of the time when you flash them in and kill 2 of your opponent's creatures in combat. Other times it will just let you go after your opponent because you're going wide. Whenever you cast it, it is likely to have an effect one way or another, since 2 reasonably sized bodies from 1 card is nice. I think this is first pickable a lot of the time. It doesn't hurt that you can splash it either. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Metropolis Sprite, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 fairy rogue at common with flying, and you can pay 1 blue, and it gets +1/-1 until end of turn. This seems kind of nice. A 2 mana 1/2 flyer isn't usually very good, but the fact that this can hit for 2 when it needs to is alright. For blue, a color that sometimes struggles to get reasonable 2-drops, this seems like one of those. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Moat Piranhas, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 3/3 fish at common with Defender. We've seen cards like this before, creatures who are very efficient but have Defender, and they are always pretty alright. If you're a defensive deck, I think you can play a couple of these and feel fine about it, and blue does look like it can be pretty defensive. It can block well early, and it isn't that hard to at least use to trade with something even late. If you're an aggro deck, this is terrible. You'll only really want this some of the time, and I think that makes it harder to give anything more than a C-. Next up, we have Muyan Ling's Sky Dancer, who for 1 generic and 2 blue is a mythic rare legendary planeswalker, Yan Ling. She starts with 2 loyalty. She has a +2 loyalty ability that says until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -2/-0 and loses flying. She's got a -3 that creates a 4/4 blue elemental bird creature token with flying that has some amazing art. And she has a -8 that says you get an emblem with islands you control have tap, draw a card. This is an interesting planeswalker. She does only start at 2 loyalty, and that means she will not be using her -3 right away to protect her, but her +2 does an alright job of protecting her too. Flyers are often a big problem for planeswalkers, and giving something -2/-0 makes it a lot harder for any creature to kill her. It reminds me of Jace Memory's Adept's ability, which was pretty sweet. So, if you can use her +2 ability to keep her alive, and then make an elemental bird token, and then sort of repeat the pattern, you're going to be in great shape, and even if you only do it once, you're going to be in good shape. If you get to make 2 birds with her, you're probably just going to win the game. I think overall she is amazing, but falls a bit short of being a bomb for me because she is so vulnerable on board states when your opponent is going wide, or even just if they're ahead of you. Still, you should take her before all the commons and uncommons in this set. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, we have Negate, which is 1 generic and a blue for a common instant that says counter target non-creature spell. I've seen this card 1,000 times, and it's usually not worth playing in the main board. That could change here, maybe, but I don't really think it will. This set looks like a kind of a normal set in terms of the spells versus creatures split, and based on past experience, I think that means it's a D main board card and a C sideboard card. Next up, we have Octo Profit, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 octopus at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2. I like playing creatures with decent stats who let me scry, though I do think those that appear lower in the curve are better because they allow you to keep a larger percentage of opening hands if it's a 1 or 2 drop that scries. A 4 drop who scries isn't quite as good at that, but scry is still great for smoothing out your draws in turn 4, and I think that makes him a C. Next up, we have Portal of Sanctuary, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1 generic and tap it to return target creature you control and each aura attached to it to their owner's hands. Activate this ability only during your turn. This seems pretty bad to me. I know this set has an Into the Battlefield theme in blue, but still, it takes an investment of 4 mana to bounce your first creature, at which point you've probably already fallen behind your opponent. Yes, it can turn into a nice engine in the late game, and I'm sure sometimes you'll keep bouncing something sweet with it, but it still seems way too clunky. Also, the part about the auras might sound like upside, but it actually takes away something useful that this could do. If you're playing against someone with aura-based removal like Pacifism, it would become significantly better if it weren't for that clause. But with it, well, your opponent just gets their Pacifism back. I can see this being a corner case playable in a deck that really goes crazy with Into the Battlefield triggers, but I don't think that'll happen enough. I'm giving it a D. Next up, we've got Renowned Weaponsmith, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human artificer at uncommon. You can tap it to add 2 generic mana to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. And you can pay 1 blue and tap him to search your library for a card named Heartpiercer Bow or Vial of Dragonfire, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. A 2 mana 1/3 is kind of an okay body, and the kind that sometimes you sight in against a bunch of X1s. This does have a lot going on in its text box. Last time we saw this card, it didn't get to be in a format that had both of the artifacts it could search up. It could only find one or the other. However, this set does have both of them. That said, it may as well not have Heartpiercer Bow because it is a pretty terrible card. Vial of Dragonfire isn't incredible, and I'll go deeper on both of those cards when we get to artifacts later in the week. But the Vial isn't exactly incredible either, though being able to search it up when you want is pretty alright and was pretty alright the last time we saw this. I think between maybe running a single Vial and a few other artifacts, and this set does have a decent number of decent artifacts, I think if you have both of those things going on, he's reasonably playable, and that's not like a stretch to ask for in blue. I think that makes him a C-. Next up, we have Sage's Row Denizen, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 Vidalcan wizard at common, and it says whenever another blue creature enters the battlefield under your control, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. I'm not usually one to get behind milling strategies in Limited. They fail to coalesce far too often, and I kind of let other people prove to me that they work out before I try to play them myself. You can use this to mill your own deck if you have some graveyard synergy, and there is a bit of that around. And the fact that it has D+ worthy stats already does mean that it isn't completely horrible, but it isn't something you want to play in an ideal world. I'm giving it a D+. Next, we have Scholar of the Ages, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 human wizard at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you return up to 2 target instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. I really hope I get to have some good times with this card. She costs 7 mana for a 3/3, which is obviously horrible on the vanilla test, but she offers the potential for a 3-for-1 since she gets you back 2 spells in your graveyard, and she has reasonable stats that should be able to trade with something. I do think she requires a build-around grade, because I think in most limited decks in the format, it won't be that easy to set her up. You need both a deck that is interested in playing the long game, and enough instants and sorceries that you can consistently get back 2 with it, and that will not always happen. I'm going to give this a D in your typical blue deck in the format, and a C+ in a deck that gets there on those requirements. I really hope she ends up performing more like Gitu Chronicler from Dominaria, because I had a pretty great time with that card. I think that generally, if you play her and get back 2 removal spells, you probably just win the game, but that mana cost and the deck building restrictions she puts on you are very real. Next up, we have Sleep Paralysis, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted creature, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. Last time we saw this, it was kind of unimpressive. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, it's just not a premium removal spell. 4 mana to tap a creature down is reasonably efficient, but it can't shut down activated or static abilities. What's more, this set has lots of ways to bounce or flicker creatures, and Sleep Paralysis is terrible against that. This is a solid removal spell. I don't want to tell you you shouldn't be playing it. I know I sound overly negative, But I think that's because this kind of card frequently gets overrated because, you know, you're like, look, it's blue's really good removal spell. And sure, that is what it is, but blue's really good removal spell falls way behind all the other colors' good removal spells, except maybe green. But the point here is it's not great, but it is a card you play one or two of in your blue decks. You kind of hope you get better removal so you don't have to play two of them at least, but they're fine. I think it's a C+. Next up, we have Spectral Sailor, which costs 1 blue mana for a 1/1 Spirit Pirate at Uncommon. It's got Flash, it's got Flying, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to draw a card. I really like this kind of card. Most of the time, a 1 mana 1/1 flyer isn't anything special, as we said earlier, because it quickly becomes outclassed by pretty much every other flyer or card with reach in the set. Spectral Sailor does have the same problem, but once it can't attack anymore, it has a powerful mana sink ability that just takes over the game if your opponent doesn't stop it. Basically, the Sailor can do a few damage early in the game, and it can also help you win games that go long. I really want to give this a B- because I feel like I'm going to treat it as one at the start of the format, but I think I am letting my favoritism get the better of me, and I'm going to roll it back to a C+. Next up, we have Tail's End, which for 1 generic and a blue is a rare instant, and it says counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or legendary spell. This one has some pretty sweet flavor text, but it's a pretty horrible card in Limited. It should never be in your main board in this format. It's an F there. Are there enough activated or triggered abilities or legendary spells for this to be worth bringing out of your sideboard? Maybe, but it isn't the kind of sideboard card that you'll find yourself bringing in at least once per draft when you take it. Many people just won't have enough of these 3 things to make it worth bringing in. Some opponents will, and it'll be nice against them, but I think you should definitely not prioritize taking this, as it is far from a key sideboard card, and you can honestly probably pick them up really late. I'm going to say it's a D+ as a sideboard card, just because it's not going to come up against most people. Next up, we have Unsummon, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and it says return target creature to its owner's hand. Unsummon is often one of the better blue commons when we see it, and I think that will be the case here too. 1 mana to return a creature is really efficient. You're basically always going to come out ahead in terms of tempo, since you're going to be bouncing things that cost a heck of a lot more than 1 mana most of the time. Additionally, bounce effects let you blow out opponents who are overly reliant on auras or combat tricks. Finally, in a pinch, you can use it to save your own creature, which will be worth it some of the time. I don't think Unsummon is quite first pickable, but I think you feel pretty good about having like 2 of these in most of your blue decks, giving it a C+. Next up, we have Warden of Fo Style, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 bird wizard at Uncommon. It's got Flying, and it says creature spells with Flying you cast cost 1 less to cast. So blue in this set, along with white and red, have an interest in flyers, and this is a nice payoff for that. As we've already said, a Windrake these days is probably a C-, but making your other flyers cost 1 less is pretty real. This format has a lot of flyers. I think this does enough to be a blue card you always play multiples of, and it doesn't seem like it will be hard to have other flyers if you're in blue, so I think you can first pick this in weaker packs. It's another B-. Next up, we have Winged Words, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common sorcery, and it says this spell costs 1 less to cast if you control a creature with flying, draw 2 cards. So another flying payoff. In a worst case scenario, this is Divination, a card that's usually somewhere in the C range in most formats. It's the kind of card that helps you dig deeper into your library to hit land drops early, and helps you reload your hand late. In the best case, it draws you 2 for 2 mana, which is a significantly better deal. Blue is, of course, as we've said, loaded up with flyers, especially if you're pairing it with white and or red. So making this cost 2 really doesn't seem like a huge challenge. So if this were a 2 mana Divination all the time, where would it be? I don't know, probably close to a B-, but it isn't always that. I think I'm going to keep it in the upper C range at a C+. Next up, we have Yerok's Wave Crasher, who for 3 generic and a blue is a 4/4 elemental at Uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. This kind of card's always a little awkward. 4 mana for a 4/4 is good and all, but the fact that this isn't a May effect means that you can't play this on an empty board. I mean, you can, but it's going to return itself. Now, the upside of returning stuff is significant. Doing so can get rid of auras that have shut a creature down, or let you abuse an enter the battlefield ability, and those things will come up when you have this thing. But I also think there will be times where playing this on turn 4 just doesn't make sense given the board state, and that's really frustrating. This may be at its best in the Bant colors, which is the most focus on into the battlefield abilities, but I still think this thing has some problems that keep it from being anything more than filler. I'm giving it a C. And our last blue card is Zephyr Charge, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment, and you can pay 1 generic and a blue to give a creature flying until end of turn. I guess you could do worse on a mana sink, but a 2-mana enchantment that adds nothing to the board right away is not very appealing to me. Giving your stuff flying can certainly be powerful, but you have to already have creatures in play who are worth giving flying to, and that means there's a significant chunk of the time where even if you have mana lying around, giving your stuff flying might not matter at all. You need the right situation to emerge for this to really excel, and I think that situation is a little too narrow. I think this is just a D, and I could really even see it dropping to F. Well, those are my thoughts on all the blue cards in this set. I'll be back tomorrow with my thoughts on all the black cards in Core Set 2020. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. And if you're looking for the playlist that has all of these videos in it, or will have all the videos in it by the end of the week, you should see it on your screen now. Thanks for watching.